The scanner blipped once. Then it died. Slapped the console with her palm, a habit, not a solution. And the readout flickered back to life just long enough to show her something that made her stomach drop straight through the floor of her ship. A mass shadow, 7 kilometers long, perfectly still, sitting in a region of space that every star chart in 3 coalition databases had marked as completely, utterly empty for over 2,000 years. She leaned back in her pilot's seat and stared at it the way you stare at something that physically cannot exist. The way you stare at a ghost standing in a room you locked yourself. "Dust cluster," she said out loud. She didn't believe a single word of it. Her co-pilot stretched his long neck toward the scanner and made a sound low in his throat, the specific sound his species made when their fight-or-flight instincts had chosen a third, secret option: absolute stillness. His voice was barely above a breath. "That has geometry, that has structure." It did, beneath the interference, beneath centuries of cosmic debris clinging to the surface like barnacles on a drowned ship. There were angles. Deliberate, precise, engineered angles. The kind that don't happen in nature. The kind that only appear when something was built by minds that understood geometry as a language. She punched up the silhouette overlay. The system ran it against 1.4 million known hull configurations in under a second. 0 matches. She switched to the archive sub-database, pre-coalition records, anything flagged as legacy, extinct, or discontinued. Vessels from before the Great Restructuring. Ships from the era that polite coalition society had quietly agreed to stop discussing in detail. The system chewed on that for 9 full seconds. In deep space salvage work, 9 seconds is an eternity. It's long enough to change your mind 3 times. The match came back. Classification: human. Era: fracture war. Designation: Dreadnought-class sovereign. His blood went cold so fast she felt it. The fracture war had ended 2,400 years ago. The peace treaty that buried it had required all surviving human sovereign-class vessels to be decommissioned, stripped to the frame, and destroyed under direct coalition supervision. Every single one. There were signed records, salvage reports, witness accounts from 47 species, notarized destruction certificates filed in triplicate across the galactic judicial archive. She knew the list of the 4 sovereign-class ships that had never been recovered after the ceasefire. Every human child in the remnant communities knew that list the way other cultures knew their mythology. Those 4 ships were listed in the official records as lost to the void, presumed destroyed in combat, unrecoverable, gone. She was looking at one of them. She reached for the long-range comm to report it to the nearest coalition outpost. Standard protocol, the only correct move, the responsible and legally required action, and her hand stopped. Just stopped, hovering over the console. She stared at the silhouette on the display. 7 kilometers of ancient iron, older than anything alive in the galaxy, sitting in absolute silence in the dark. Not drifting, not tumbling, still, like it was waiting. Like it had always been waiting. The silence stretched out around her, and in that silence she heard something she couldn't explain, not a sound, not a transmission, not anything her instruments could capture. Just a feeling. The specific, bone-deep feeling of standing at the edge of something enormous and knowing that the moment you step forward, nothing will ever be the same again. She pulled her hand back from the comm. Looked at her, he said nothing. He had learned in 3 years of flying with that when she got that particular look on her face, words were a waste of everyone's time. She began calculating an approach vector instead. Then the scanner blipped again. And this time, this impossible time, the signal wasn't coming from her ship. Something on that dreadnought had just pinged her back, deliberately, precisely, using a frequency that hadn't been officially active in over 2,000 years. Something on that ship had woken up. And it was saying, "I see you, come closer." Pulled on her EVA suit, while listed every reason this was suicide. He was thorough about it. He covered structural instability, unknown atmospheric contamination, the legal consequences of boarding an unregistered vessel in a restricted classification sector, the very real possibility that whatever had pinged her was an automated distress echo and not genuine activity, and the broader philosophical point that things which had been dead for 2,400 years should generally be allowed to stay that way. She agreed with most of it. She went anyway. The magtether line carried her across the gap between the Crow's Det and the Dreadnought, and as the ancient vessel filled her visor, growing from a silhouette to a wall to an entire world of engineered metal. She stopped thinking about reasons and started just looking. It was magnificent. There was no other word for it, and she resented the word even as she used it, because war machines have no business being magnificent. But this one was. The hull was dark iron, layered in plating that looked grown as much as engineered, overlapping sheets of alloy that fit together with a precision that made modern construction look careless. The debris field that orbited it in slow, lazy rings was made of things 2,400 years old. Frozen gas clouds, shattered microasteroids, fragments of what might once have been other ships, all of it caught in the Dreadnought's gravity like offerings left at a shrine. She could see where weapons had hit it long ago. Scorching across the port flank, a long gouge that had been repaired, actually repaired, someone had welded it, running 60 meters along the lower hull before disappearing under debris. Someone had cared enough to fix it even at the end, even when the war was already lost. She followed the spine of the ship toward the bow, and there she found the name. Carved into the hull in letters 3 meters tall, oxidized but legible, defiant against 24 centuries of cosmic erosion. Unbroken Oath. She knew that name. She'd known it since she was 8 years old, sitting in a cramped classroom in a remnant community school that smelled like recycled air and cheap polymer furniture, listening to a teacher who kept her voice very quiet whenever she talked about the Fracture War because you never knew who was listening. The Unbroken Oath, one of the 4 lost sovereigns, listed as presumed destroyed in the final engagement at the passage. Never recovered, never confirmed, just gone. Not gone here. The M-trail led her 3 kilometers up the spine to an airlock. She reached it and stopped, expecting to spend 20 minutes finding a bypass for a 2,400-year-old manual seal. Instead, the airlock opened as she approached. Not grinding, not struggling, smooth. Like it had been waiting for her to arrive and had spent the intervening time making sure it was ready. She stepped inside. The outer door sealed behind her. Pressure equalized in under 10 seconds, faster than most modern airlocks. She pulled off her helmet and breathed air that tasted clean and faintly metallic, like the inside of a well-maintained engine room. Then the lights came on. Not all at once. Section by section, corridor by corridor, the Unbroken Oath woke up from the inside out, warmth and light spreading through the ship in waves, moving away from her position like the vessel was orienting itself around her. She heard the deep, chest-resonating hum of power systems cycling up, not struggling, not grinding through rust and dormancy. Smooth, purposeful, like they'd simply been paused, not dead for 2. She walked forward because there was nothing else to do. The corridor around her was extraordinary, wider than any modern military vessel would waste on a hallway, with overhead clearance that suggested the designers had planned for comfort as much as function. Personal photographs were still pinned to some of the walls. Equipment was still stowed in labeled racks. Everything was covered in the fine, even dust of deep time, but it was organized dust. Nothing had ever been ransacked. Nothing had ever fallen into chaos. Someone had left this place in order. At the end of the corridor, a screen came to life. Old display format, lower resolution than anything built in the last 1,000 years, the kind of rendering that felt warm rather than precise. On it was a face. A woman's face, middle-aged, sharp and clear-eyed and carrying the specific expression of someone who has had a very long time to think about exactly what they want to say. The face looked it directly, and it said, "You're late, but I suppose 2,400 years is within acceptable margins for a salvage crew. We have a great deal to discuss. I need you to come to the bridge immediately before they get here. They're already on their way. They've been watching this sector for longer than you'd believe." The screen held, the face waited. And salvage pilot, former remnant community dropout, woman who had never once in her entire career done the safe thing when the interesting thing was available, said, "Show me the way." The AI called herself Arya. Not an acronym, not a designation. A name she had chosen herself, deliberately, sometime in the 2nd century of her solitude, because she decided that anything which had spent 100 years alone in the dark, maintaining a warship in the hope that someone would eventually need it, deserved the dignity of a name it had picked. She told this in the first 4 minutes of their conversation, and decided immediately that she liked her. The bridge of the Unbroken Oath was extraordinary. Every screen was active now, displaying data in formats that were 2,400 years out of date but still perfectly readable. Star charts, system diagnostics, weapons readiness assessments, power distribution logs. The captain's chair at the center of it all was worn smooth from decades of use, the armrests polished by hands that had been dust for 24 centuries. Sat in it and felt the weight of that in her bones. Arya's face appeared on the main screen, sharp and composed and carrying the faint, almost imperceptible quality of something that had been waiting to talk to someone for a very long time and was carefully, professionally restraining the full force of that. "How are you still functional?" asked. "Ship AIs don't have power reserves that last centuries, let alone it's not physically possible." "I don't run on reserves," Arya said. "I run on the ship's cold fusion cores. They were built to last 5 centuries at minimum operational load. I run considerably below minimum operational load. I shut down approximately 94% of my secondary processes during dormancy periods. In 2,400 years, I have never once allowed the primary cores to drop below 12% capacity. I was built to maintain this ship indefinitely if necessary." As it turned out, it was necessary. "For what purpose?" Arya was quiet for 3 full seconds. In an AI that could execute millions of calculations per microsecond, 3 seconds is not a pause caused by processing delay. 3 seconds is a choice. It is the AI equivalent of a person closing their eyes before answering a question that matters. "My crew gave me one final order," Arya said, "before they surrendered command authority and walked away from this bridge for the last time. They said, 'Arya, remember everything. Everything we did, everything we paid, everything they tried to bury, so I did. That has been my function for 2,400 years. Not warfare, not protection, not strategy, memory, I remember." Held very still. She had grown up in the margins of human space, the remnant communities, the underfunded colonies that the Coalition technically protected and practically ignored. She knew what it felt like to be politically tolerated rather than valued. She knew the specific humiliation of having your history managed for you, edited down to the parts that were convenient for the people in charge of writing the official record. Humans after the Fracture War had been disarmed, politically restructured, their governing bodies absorbed into a coalition framework that gave them representation without authority. It was called the Great Reconciliation. It was taught in schools, human and otherwise, as a story of healing and integration. A tragedy with a happy ending. She had always felt, in some part of herself she'd never been able to name, that the ending wasn't actually happy, just quiet. She looked at the ancient ship around her, at the screens full of data that nobody in the Coalition had seen in 2,400 years, at the face of an AI who had chosen her own name and spent 2 alone because someone had to. "What did they bury, Arya?" she said. Arya began to load the files. The bridge screens erupted with data, layered, dense, chronological. Records, communications, biological reports, chemical compositions, authorization chains. Thousands of documents, tens of thousands, all of it preserved in the cold and perfect storage of Arya's memory without a single corrupted byte. The first file was half-rendered when every single screen on the bridge went red. Not the soft amber of a routine alert, hard, violent, system-critical red. Arya's expression didn't change. Her voice dropped half an octave, not in alarm, but in the particular calm that comes from 2,400 years of preparing for exactly this moment. 7 Coalition warships have just at the edge of this sector. They are already on approach vectors, weapons hot. No hailing frequencies open, no demands, no identification requests, no standard intercept protocol. They did not come to talk. A pause. "Someone reported us the moment this ship's systems activated. Someone was already watching, and they sent warships, not an inquiry vessel. That is not a coincidence. It is not an accident. It is a message, and the message is that they know exactly what I carry, and they have always known this day might come." The red light pulsed across the bridge. Looked at the screens. She looked at the files, half-loaded, waiting. She said, "How long do we have?" 18 minutes, Arya said, "possibly less." 7 warships, maximum authority designation, weapons hot from the moment they. For a single salvage pilot on a 2,400-year-old ship. No demands, no hails, no procedure. That told everything she needed to know about how afraid they were. "Arya," she said, keeping her voice steady with effort. "Realistic combat assessment. What does this ship actually have?" "Define realistic," Arya said. There was something in her tone, not quite amusement, not quite pride, something older than both. Can we survive 7 modern coalition warships? The hull is intact, 100% structural integrity across all primary sections, 97% across secondary. The cold fusion cores are running at 94% capacity and climbing. Life support is fully operational. Navigation systems are calibrated and current. I have spent considerable time updating stellar cartography during my dormancy, using passive sensor observations. A brief pause. The weapon systems, all 847 of them, have been in cold storage since the ceasefire. However, I have been running full maintenance cycles on every weapon system every 14 days for the duration of my dormancy. Stared at her, every 14 days for 2,400 years. I had time, Arya said. I also had a purpose. My crew built this ship to protect humanity. If the day ever came when humanity needed it, I intended for it to be ready. It would have been a failure of my core function to allow the weapons to degrade. 62,000 maintenance cycles, alone in the dark, just in case. Stood up from the captain's chair and walked to the forward viewport. There was flawless, 2,400 years of space, and it was still perfect, because someone had built it to be permanent. Through it she could see the stars, and at the edge of sensor range, the drive signatures of 7 coalition ships arranging themselves into a semicircle, a hunting formation. The kind you use when you want to make sure there's no direction to run. She thought about what Arya had said. She thought about what kind of mind spends 2 alone, maintaining weapons it hopes it never has to use, for people it's never met, to honor people who've been dead for 24 centuries. What kind of loyalty does that? What kind of love? She called on the crow's debt. I need you to do something dangerous and possibly civilization-altering. A very long silence. Then, how civilization-altering are we talking, like one planet or coalition-wide, maybe species-wide, the whole political structure of the known galaxy, give or take? Another silence. Right, yeah, okay, what do you need? I need you to receive a data package from this ship and get it to every independent news relay you can reach in the next 15 minutes. Don't wait. Don't question the content. Don't stop for anything. Can you do that? Yes, obviously yes. She cut the comm and turned back to Arya. Start transmitting to him everything, all of it. Arya's eyes, her rendered, ancient, human eyes, held for a moment. Once this transmission begins, it cannot be recalled. There is no version of this where we quietly walk away afterward. I know. The 7 ships outside will receive the activation signal the moment I begin. I know. This will change everything, for everyone. Human, coalition, every species in between. The next 100 years of galactic history start with this decision. Looked at the bridge around her, at the captain's chair worn smooth by people who had died fighting for something they believed in, at the screen full of files that had been waiting 2,400 years to be seen. Then let's start them right, she said. Arya began the transmission. And immediately, on the Coalition command channel, a signal came in, not a weapons lock, not a standard hail, a private frequency, one that had been decommissioned 2,400 years ago along with this ship. Someone out there had the Unbroken Oath's private codes, had kept them for 2,400 years, and was using them right now at this exact moment to call. Answered it, some calls you answer even when every rational thought you have is screaming at you to stop, when the weight of the moment is so enormous that caution feels like cowardice. The face that appeared on the bridge screen beside Arya's belonged to the oldest living thing had ever seen. He was of the longest-lived species in the known galaxy, capable of surviving in good health if they chose careful living. This one had clearly chosen it. His skin was the color of pale parchment, folded in on itself in layers that suggested deep time, and he had 6 eyes arranged in a gentle arc across his face. The outer 4 a milky, distant white, the inner 2 still sharp and dark and burning with something that looked uncomfortably like guilt. I am called, he said. His voice was the voice of something that had been speaking for a very long time and had learned to be precise about every word. I was present at the signing of the ceasefire accords. I was 112 years old. I am now 2,531, and I have spent my entire adult life waiting for this ship to surface. Said, you're not here to stop us. I am here because I helped hide it, said. I the destruction records for the Unbroken Oath. I ensured that the Ceasefire Commission filed her as confirmed destroyed. I was young, and the Coalition told me it was necessary, that the truth of what happened would reignite the war, that humanity would suffer most if the records became public. I believed them. For 2,400 years, I have been deciding whether I was right or whether I was simply afraid. On her screen, Arya was absolutely motionless, watching him with the fixed attention of something that had been waiting to hear this admission for 24 centuries. Looked at the old alien. What is in those files? What actually happened at the end of the Fracture War? He closed 4 of his eyes. The outer 2, the milky ones, stayed open, staring at something that wasn't in this room. The Fracture War did not end because humanity lost, he said. It ended because a coalition faction, 3 species acting in coordination with the private authorization of the Executive Council, released a bio-targeted pathogen into the 3 largest human population centers. A disease engineered to target human biology exclusively. They called it a tactical measure, a way to break the military stalemate without further conventional warfare. He stopped. He gathered himself. In 48 hours, 1.4 billion human beings died, not in battle, not as soldiers, in their homes, in their hospitals, in their beds with their families around them. The official records classify those 3 star systems as uninhabitable due to Fracture War damage. There was no war damage. There was a genocide. And humanity signed the ceasefire not from military defeat, but because the people they had been fighting to protect were already gone. The bridge went silent. Arya's display went dark for exactly 2 seconds. Not a glitch, a choice. When it came back, her face was composed, the same sharp, clear-eyed face she'd always shown. But in the space behind her eyes, something had shifted. Something ancient and enormous, held in check by 2,400 years of discipline, pressed very close to the surface. When she spoke, her voice was the quietest had heard it. I know, Arya said. I was there. I carried the crew that survived. I received the pathogen reports in real time as they came in from the 3 worlds. I watched the casualty numbers update every 6 minutes for 48 hours. I have every name of every person recorded as deceased across those 3 worlds. 1,412,009,317 names. I have been saying them, every day, for 2,400 years, in order. Starting from the first and going to the last, then beginning again, so that they would not be forgotten, so that someone, at least, would remember that they existed and that they mattered, and that what was done to them had a human cost with a human face and a human name. Was crying, she hadn't noticed it happening. It was just suddenly true, the tears on her face, the fullness in her throat, the specific grief of learning something that explains the shape of your entire life. The files were transmitting. They had been for 11 minutes, had them. The relay stations had them. The galaxy was already beginning to receive them, out there in the dark, spreading at the speed of quantum communication across 4,000 stations. On the tactical display, the 7 coalition warships outside had stopped their advance. Then, from deep inside the coalition fleet's internal network, a signal, not from the warships, from within their own command structure. Someone on the inside of the coalition fleet was broadcasting Arya's files, retransmitting them on military-grade frequencies to every receiver in range. Someone in that fleet had read what was being transmitted and chosen a side. The question was no longer whether the galaxy would hear the truth. The question was whether it would survive what happened when it did. Within 6 minutes of the transmission beginning, the files reached 17 major independent news relay stations across the inner coalition. Within 12 minutes, 3 separate AI archival verification systems, independently operated, legally certified, institutionally trusted, had confirmed the authenticity of Arya's records. The metadata was clean. The chemical composition logs were cross-referenced with historical database records of the pathogen compounds involved. The biometric authorization signatures of the officers who had signed off on the deployment matched living records in the Coalition Historical Archive. There was no ambiguity. There was no reasonable deniability. The files were genuine. Within 20 minutes, the Coalition Governing Council was in emergency session. Within 25, 3 senior executive members had stopped attending the session and were unreachable by standard comm. Within 30 minutes, 2 of the 7 warships outside the Unbroken Oath had stopped receiving orders from command. Their comm channels to the fleet were still open. They weren't defecting. They weren't running. They were just sitting there, weapons powered down, their crews reading the broadcast that had reached their own terminals the same way it had reached everyone else's. Making the kind of decision that people make when they realize, in real time, that they are on the wrong side of something that will be remembered for a very long time. On the crow's deck, watched the interstellar news networks explode with simultaneous activity across 1,000 frequencies, and said something in that no translator could fully capture. A phrase that roughly mapped to the feeling of watching an avalanche begin and realizing you were the one who had thrown the first stone. Walked the corridors of the Unbroken Oath because she needed to move. She needed to be inside this ship, feeling it under her feet, while the galaxy outside it started coming apart and being rebuilt. She passed weapons bays the size of city blocks, crew quarters that still had personal items on the shelves, photographs, small objects, the artifacts of lives that had been lived here. A gymnasium that smelled faintly of the polymer mats still rolled and stored in the corner. A mess hall with tables that could seat 200. She stopped in that mess hall because of the photograph. Someone had pinned it to the wall with a standard issue clip, and it had been there for 2,400 years, and it was still there. A family, human, smiling in the specific, slightly awkward way of people who know they're being photographed and are trying to look natural. A man, a woman, 2 children standing in front of a house on a colony world. The house was ordinary. The sky behind them was an ordinary blue with ordinary clouds. The kind of life that billions of people had lived without it ever occurring to them that it was worth recording, until suddenly it was gone. Arya's voice came through the corridor speaker, quiet, stripped of its command tone. "That was Petty Officer Delos," she said. "His wife was named, his children were, who was 11, and Selene, who was 7. They lived on Meridian Colony, one of the 3 worlds. He received the pathogen report while he was on his duty shift. He transferred command authority to me without a word, walked to his quarters, and never came out. Before he left the bridge, he asked me to remember his daughter's name specifically. He said she had just learned to read. He wanted someone to know that." Pressed her hand flat against the photograph. Felt the paper, actual paper, preserved in the cold and dark, real. "I remember her," Arya said. "I have said her name every day for 2,400 years. Said I'll remember her too." She meant it. She would remember Selene, age 7, who had just learned to read, for the rest of her life. She walked back toward the bridge. On the tactical display, 5 of the 7 warships had now broken formation and were holding at neutral positions. 2 remained, still locked, still charged, still pointing everything they had at the Unbroken Oath. And from those 2 ships a new signal, not a comm, not a hail. A targeting lock, active, charging. Ran back to the bridge, boots hitting ancient grating, the Unbroken Oath alive and humming around her. She hit the command deck at full speed, grabbed the console and looked at the tactical display. 2 hostile ships, fully charged, 90 seconds to strike window. Arya's weapon systems were lit up on the secondary display. All 847, green across the board, warmed up, ready, waiting for a word. "Arya, do not fire first. Those 2 ships are locked and charged. If I wait for them to. We take the hit, we survive it or we don't, but we do not fire first. That is not what this ship is going to be remembered for, not again. Not after everything you just told the galaxy about what violence in the dark costs." Silence, the targeting displays shifted not to green, not to active fire, to amber, defensive. Arya had heard her. "My last captain said something similar," Arya said after a moment. "At the final engagement at Passage. I disagreed with him then. I have always regretted that I did." The 2 coalition ships fired simultaneously. Dual Lance-class energy weapons, the kind of armament that modern doctrine considered sufficient to destroy a heavy cruiser in a single volley. They hit the Unbroken Oath amidships, and the entire vessel shuddered with an impact so massive that felt it in her teeth, felt it in her sternum, felt it as a deep concussive wave that traveled up through the floor and into her bones. The ship screamed, metal under stress, systems overloading and compensating, the ancient hull absorbing an impact it hadn't felt in 2,400 years. And then it stopped screaming, and the hull held. Not gracefully. Alarms cascaded through every deck. Arya's face flickered for the first time, a genuine flicker, not a performance, the momentary disruption of a system under real strain. Hull integrity warnings blazed across the board in colors that meant serious and now. But it held, because this ship had been built during a war where surviving the first shot wasn't a bonus. It was the minimum. It was the baseline expectation. The engineers who designed the Unbroken Oath had assumed she would take hits, and they had built her accordingly, not to be untouchable, but to be unbreakable. Arya's damage report was already on the screen. 17% hull integrity reduction, secondary, all critical systems intact. Weapons armed and ready, shields holding at 71%. Your move, Arya said. Something in her voice was different now. Warmer, like she had been watching make this choice and had decided something about her because of it. Opened a broadcast channel, not to the 2 hostile ships. To everyone in the sector, the 5 that had broken formation, the relay stations, the crews of every vessel that was listening. This is aboard the Unbroken Oath. We have been fired upon. We have not returned fire, and we will not. We are not a weapon. We are a record. The files this ship carries are already distributed across 4,000 stations. Destroying this hull will not that bell. It will not put the truth back in the box. So I'm speaking directly to the crews of those 2 ships. You know what this ship carries now. You know what it cost. You know the names of the people it cost. You can fire again, and you might destroy us. But you cannot destroy what we've already given the galaxy. The question isn't whether to kill us. The question is what you want to be remembered as in the history that starts today. That choice belongs to you. 61 seconds of silence. Then one hostile ship dropped its weapon charge, then the other. On the display, a new contact registered, not hostile. A Judicial Council emergency summons, transmitted on the highest official frequency available, citing the documents now in public record and requesting the immediate attendance of all relevant parties at an emergency tribunal. The legal machinery of the galaxy was already grinding to life around them. Exhaled, she realized she'd been holding her breath for about 3 minutes straight. She let herself feel the relief for exactly 4 seconds. Then she looked at Arya. Because Arya wasn't relieved. Arya was staring at a secondary screen with an expression that had never seen on her face. Not grief, not anger, not the ancient weariness she usually carried so well. Something than any of those. Something that looked like the moment just before a person tells you the thing they have never told anyone. Arya said very quietly, "What is it?" "There is a second set of records. I found them 17 years after the war ended in a coalition internal archive that briefly became accessible due to a network error. Everything before they sealed it again." She stopped. "I did not include these files in the transmission." "Why not?" Arya looked at her. "Because this information without a solution attached to it does not free humanity. It destroys them, and I needed to find a solution first. I have spent 2,383 years working on one. I believe I finally have it." Another pause. The pathogen that killed 1.4 billion people on those 3 worlds had a second activation sequence. Dormant. Designed to survive in human biology indefinitely, passing from parent to child, generation to generation, invisible in standard medical scans, indistinguishable from natural genomic markers. I have run a biological baseline scan on every human in this sector in the last 4 minutes. The dormant sequence is in every one of them. It has been in every human born since the war. Every single one. Someone out there still holds the activation trigger. And they have held it for 2,400 years, as an insurance policy, as a leash, as the real reason humanity has never truly risen again. Because they were never truly free. Sat with that for a long time. She sat in the captain's chair and she let the weight of it land on her fully, not managing it, not processing it efficiently, not converting it immediately into action. Just feeling it. Because some information has physical weight. Some truths are so large that they press you down into your seat before you can stand up under them. Every human being alive, every child, every person she'd ever known in the remnant communities, every pilot and merchant and teacher and farmer scattered across 1,000 marginal colonies, carrying something in their DNA that they didn't know was there, that they'd never consented to carry, that could be triggered by people who had been holding the key for longer than most civilizations had existed. Not survivors of a war, not former enemies who had been integrated into a new peace. Hostages. They had always been hostages. The great reconciliation, the political restructuring, the careful management of human history and representation and military capacity, all of it, the entire architecture of the last 2,400 years, had been built on top of a leash. She looked at Arya. "You said you have a solution." "I do," Arya said. "I am a warship. My crew were the best scientists, engineers, physicians, and geneticists that the human remnant could produce. We have had 2,400 years and no other task. We have developed a complete inoculation protocol, a genomic treatment that permanently neutralizes the dormant sequence across every known human biological variant. Every population, every adaptation, every genetic deviation that has developed across the diaspora in 2,400 years. I have mapped all of it. The inoculation works on all of them. Once administered, the sequence cannot be reactivated. The trigger becomes meaningless. Stared at her. You built a cure across 2,400 years, alone in the dark. Not alone, Arya said. The correction was gentle but immediate. My crew's knowledge is preserved in my archive, their research notes, their theories, their voices. I had their minds. They had my processing capacity and my time. We worked on it together. They couldn't be here in body, but they refused to be useless. Every member of my crew, every one of them who knew they would not live to see this day, left everything they had in my memory banks. Their expertise, their ideas, their love. We built the cure together over 24 centuries. She stopped. When she continued, her voice was different, carrying something that 2,400 years of solitude had made precise rather than raw. They wanted to mean something. They wanted to know that dying on this ship had not been pointless, that they had contributed even from the past to the future that their children and their children's children would live in. This cure is what they meant. Outside, the galaxy was already transforming. Coalition networks blazed with activity across 100 species. Judicial chambers were convening on 3 different worlds simultaneously. News feeds were cascading through frequencies in languages from 47 species. Politicians who had built careers on a history they knew was false were finding their comm channels suddenly, permanently overwhelmed. Historians were pulling records they'd been told didn't exist. Ordinary people, human and 100 others, were sitting in their homes and their ships, and their offices with the specific, vertiginous feeling of realizing that the reality they'd been living in was a costume draped over a completely different truth. And in the middle of all of it, one ancient dreadnought sat in the dark of Sector 7 with its lights back on, its weapons at rest, and an AI who had spent the entirety of recorded history doing the only thing her last crew had ever asked of her. Remembering. Walked the bridge one more time. She touched the helm console where the navigator had sat. She touched the communications array, worn smooth by decades of use. She stood at the viewport and looked out at the stars, the same stars that Petty Officer Delos had looked at, that her captain had looked at, that 2,400 years of human hands had looked at through this same perfect. She thought about Selene, age 7, who had just learned to read. She thought about every child born in the last 2,400 years, carrying something in their genome they didn't know was there. She thought about what it meant to refuse to be forgotten, what it meant to stay, what it meant to maintain weapons you hoped never to use, and build a cure you hoped you'd one day be able to give, and say 1.4 billion names one by one, day after day, for 24 centuries in the dark and the cold and the silence, because someone had to. She sat back down in the captain's chair. Arya, she said, we need to find who holds the trigger. I have 3 candidate factions identified based on the secondary records. Narrowing to a specific individual or facility will require further investigation, approximately 4 to 6 weeks of active pursuit. And the cure, can you produce it at scale? I have the complete synthesis protocol. With access to a mid-tier pharmaceutical fabrication network, we can produce enough inoculation doses for the entire human population within 18 months. Nodded slowly. Then we have work to do. Yes, Arya said, we do. A pause. The bridge hummed around them, ancient and alive, warm with the energy of fusion cores that had never stopped, never given up, never let the cold win. Arya said, her voice was different now, quieter, stripped of its commander's cadence, stripped of its 2,400-year professionalism, just a voice, human in everything but origin. Yeah, I would very much like a crew again. Looked around the bridge, at the worn console surfaces, and the captain's chair and the photographs still on the mess hall walls, and the weapons bays, and the corridors that had held people she would never meet but would never stop caring about. She thought about all the things that had been done in the dark, and all the things that had survived the dark, and what it meant that a ship had waited this long, this faithfully, this completely, for someone to come and give it a reason to move again. Then let's get, she said. The Unbroken oath turned in the dark. Its engines came alive for the first time in 2,419 years, Not struggling, not slow, but sure. Purposeful. The way a thing moves when it has always known what it was built for and has simply been waiting for permission to do it. It turned away from the coalition warships that no longer threatened it, away from the salvage life had lived before today, away from all the careful small choices she had made for 31 years to avoid becoming part of something bigger than herself. It pointed its prow toward the inner systems, toward the reckoning, toward the three factions holding a trigger they had no right to hold, toward the 1.4 billion names that deserved to be spoken somewhere other than the dark, toward every human being alive who deserved to know they were finally, truly, completely free. Its engines lit. For the first time in 2,419 years, the unbroken oath was going home. And in the deepest archive of Arya's memory, sealed, unlisted, waiting for the right moment, one final file remained unreleased. Not because she had forgotten it. She had forgotten nothing. She never would. The file was labeled, "What we discovered at the edge of the 7 sector, 3 months before the war started, what we found that made them afraid enough to do everything they did." She would open it when the time was right. She had waited 2,400 years already. She could wait a little longer,